Hello and welcome to this episode of Akrinos Access. I'm your host, Adam Cmejla, joined today by Adam Cmejla. Adam Cmejla is a certified financial planner, and he is the founder and principal at Integrated Planning and Wealth Management, which is a specialty financial advisory firm that specializes in working solely with optometrists across North America. Adam, it is a pleasure to have you here on this episode of Access to join me in this deep dive into free cash flows, right? And helping doctors better understand how to truly enhance the financial health of their practice. So first and foremost, it's great to have you here back on the show. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate, as always, the invite. I always love it when we get the opportunity to chop it up, have a great conversation, and just happen to do it in public for everybody to watch and listen to. So thank you again for having me. Appreciate it.
Let's do it. Absolutely. And for those that are joining us live across various platforms, if you got any questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat, and that'll notify us here in the studio, and we'd love to address those as we may. So, Adam, let's kind of kick it off with just unpacking a little bit around what is free cash flows. Help us understand. Help our viewers understand. We talk about free cash flows. What exactly are we referring to?
So I think this is another example of the answer staring at us right in the face, but we think of, because it's an accounting term and because it's not an optometry term, we are free cash flows. What does that mean? That sounds like a really complicated word. It's like, actually, the name of it is, or how we define it is pretty much the name. It's like retained earnings. Like ODs are, what are retained earnings? It's, I show it on the balance sheet, and it's like, they're earnings that are retained in your business, hence retained earnings. So what is free cash flow? Free cash flow is cash flow that is free from any other obligation in the practice of either operating cash flow needs. So what does it take to operate the business? Or capital expenditures, the amount of expenses that you're going to incur by spending money on equipment, on inventory, on expense, something along those lines that is not necessarily applicable or needed for the daily operations in your business. Now, with that being said, the one area that I will hear the definition get bent a little bit, like that is the traditional book definition of free cash flow in the accounting world, or in GAAP, right? Generally accepted accounting principles. What admittedly I have been guilty of as well in some conversations, when I see get tossed around sometimes as well, is, well, free cash flow must mean it's the amount of cash flow that is free from everything. Notably, the one thing that is not included in the traditional book definition of free cash flow is debt repayment. And so sometimes you'll see ODs talk about, or you'll hear it be talked about in practice management circles. It's like, well, free cash flow is the amount of cash flow that you have as an owner after all expenses plus debt service has been paid. And it's like, okay, if that's the definition that you want to have, great, that's fine. You can run your business how you want to run it. The challenge with that is if you just want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples, or that you're comparing apples to apples, if you are comparing your practice against any type of benchmark, or you're having valuation conversations about what is the definition and what does that number and how do we reconcile those two. So that would be the one asterisk that I would put next to that, which admittedly, depending on where you're at in the stage of owning your practice, can be a decent number, right? If you just bought your practice, or you just or you're a cold start, the amount of debt service that you have on your books and the amount of cash flow that you will need in the business to service the debt is likely going to be a lot more than a 30-year established practice that is essentially maybe or entirely debt-free. The difference is where you go to look for that. So debt service, if you want to find that number, how much debt service you have, you're going to look at your statement of cash flows. That's where you're going to find that debt service number, which would then essentially be added to the amount of operating expenses and capital expenditures to figure out what the true cash obligation of the business is. Leave it to me to take 4 minutes to answer the first question.
What I really like, I mean, obviously, and it's, well, for starters, Adam, it is vitally important that folks understand this stuff. I mean, it starts with like understanding that's how you empower yourself to make the decisions. But it's really important to understand a lot of these intricacies, right?
Yeah.
Because let's face it, these concepts, I mean, you have high level licensure as a CFP, but anyone can have conversation around these concepts and throw around ideas, and anyone else listening can be like, oh, that sounds good, it worked for them, so I think it'll work for me, or however they go about it. But it's so vitally important. I really like how you pointed out this piece of debt service as well, right? As you know, we do a ton of cold starts, and also not just cold starts like it's my first practice, but now we're getting into helping practices add third, fourth locations as they're going, expanding. And it's really important to understand the implications of that debt service and be sure that is captured in creating the financial projections for the business. Certainly do not want to overlook that. And I also like how, to your point, you mentioned, and I think this kind of tees up where we're going to go next in the conversation, which is like the role of free cash flows and impacts to the practice, like at different stages of the practice, from cold start through perhaps a newly purchased practice where maybe the cash flow is there, right? Compared to those that are maybe a bit more established, perhaps even approaching that transition phase. So why don't you speak a little bit to that, kind of the role of these free cash flows and the use of cash at these different stages of the practice?
Well, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, what we want to do with this is understand we own a business to provide cash flow. At the end of the day, we want to know how much am I going to make from this practice? How much am I gonna how much there's essentially basically three different questions that we want to answer as part of owning a business, or said differently, what it's going to mean to essentially buy a business and buy a practice. What we're trying to understand is, like, is this a good business to own? Like, do I really want to buy this practice, right? So the fundamental questions: number one, is this a good practice to buy? And I'll address it kind of on the buyer as well as the startup phase, because both of them, regardless of which way that you're going, what we're wanting to know is, how much cash am I going to get for this business above and beyond what I'm getting for practicing optometry? Because in the absence of doing that, and again, we're primarily talking about this through the quantitative lens of what the business means to us quantitatively. Qualitatively, we own businesses because we want to chart our own path, and we want to practice in the way that we want to practice. We want to control the patient experience, right? To sum it all up in a maybe snarky but very concise way, we don't want to be told what to do. That's typically the qualitative, and we can take derivatives of that. But again, there's more to unpack in that. But quantitatively, we own businesses because we want to get a return on that investment, in addition to the work, to the value that we're getting and how we're getting paid to work in the practice, to see patients. So the three questions that we're going to ask if we're going to start a practice or we're going to buy a practice is this a good practice to buy, right? Or is this a good place to start a practice if we're doing a cold start? Number two, what is a fair price to pay for this practice? And number three, based off of one and two, at the end of the day, how much money will I make from owning this practice? And if we go in the early stages of that practice ownership, this is why it's so vitally important. And we have a tool, we have a spreadsheet that we have as part of our ultimate financial success toolkit that's available on our website. If anybody wants to download that, we have a spreadsheet in that toolkit that will allow you to plug in the various parts of a practice valuation: the revenue, the gross profit, the expenses, which will generate your operating income. And then you can take, all right, how much debt am I going to have to finance? And what is the rate of that debt? Is that over 5 years, 10 years, or sometimes banks are doing now 15 years? So at the end of the day, oh, and by the way, let's not forget taxes, because we're going to have to pay taxes on that profit as well. So the net, right? After expenses, after taxes, after debt service, how much cash am I going to have? And that kind of comes back to what I mentioned in my first point. Sometimes people will identify that as free cash flow. And again, I'm not going to sit here and say that, well, this is what you have to call free cash flow and this is the only definition. I'm just saying, however we're The context of how we're talking about it, we just need to be very transparent in what that definition is when we're using that term. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And something really important that I think needs to be at the forefront, getting back to what you mentioned a moment ago, when we're looking at this quantitatively, it's also the fact that you're going to go to the bank and borrow a big old chunk of money. And it's always a question of where could that money be invested elsewhere, right? And I know, Adam,
Mhm.
you were on a previous episode of Access. We were talking about just that, right? Like where you're investing these dollars, I
Yeah.
guess, in the practice as an asset, seeing the ROI of that compared to other assets you may own in your portfolio. And applied here, it's this idea of are we going to go and borrow a large chunk of money that's just going to kind of putt along, or is this a true opportunity to place these dollars somewhere and see that growth, see that ROI? So as it were, why don't we break this down and look a little bit from the standpoint of free cash flows impacting strategic decisions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Getting into, we look at kind of the landscape right now as we're having this conversation, February of 2024, having this conversation. There's a lot of exciting things going on in eye care. Remarkable time for practices to grow and scale and expand, given this expanding scope of care and certainly the growing public health need. So, why don't you share a little bit about how assessing free cash flows can play into some of these big strategic decisions that the doctors may be facing?
Well, I think another example of why one of the tenets that we always talk with relationships that we're privileged to serve about is to not redline your practice. And what we mean by redlining the practice is it's so the evolution of or not really the evolution, but the process goes something like this. Doctor finally either literally or either does or does not get a handle on the financials of their practice. If they do get a handle on the financials of their practice and they realize just how much cash flow they're able to siphon off of the practice, which we are all about. Like I'm not this consultant, this advisor that will say, oh, keep all the money in the business and just have a huge balance in your checking account or your savings account and don't get any money out of the business. No, we are absolutely advocates for using the practice as a conduit for cash flow. It's one of my catchphrases that I've talked about on our podcast on 2020 Money for years, that the business of optometry is a phenomenal conduit of cash flow to provide for your personal needs. But there's an asterisk next to that. That asterisk is you still have to be a good steward of the cash flow in the practice and not redline your personal lifestyle up to 100% or sometimes more of what that practice is generating, because you want to have some level of agency and flexibility in when the business is asking you for more cash flow. Examples of that: you're booked out 5, 6, 7 weeks in advance and you only have 2 exam lanes and you're thinking, gosh, I want to get into aesthetics a little bit more, and I see a need for that in my patients. I've got 1 or 2 team members that would love to do that. I've got the space over here to do it, but the opportunity cost, if I take one of my 2 exam lanes away right now it's an either or. Now I'm doing aesthetics or comp exams or eye care. It's like I want this to be an and conversation. I want to keep going back and forth between 2 exam lanes, and we want to do this. Like, okay, you go through that strategic decision making. That and requires dollars. So if
Yeah.
that and requires a build out of another lane, or and a piece of equipment that you have to add, or and training for a team member, right? The common denominator in those variables is cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. It's going to require an investment of dollars. And you have 2 options as a practice owner as far as where you go to the well. You either go to your own well and bank on yourself. Hint, bringing retained earnings back into the conversation. Some of the cash that you keep in the business could be the retained earnings of the practice. And now, voila, guess what? You don't have to go to the bank and borrow money at an arguably higher interest. Well, it's not arguably. It absolutely is a higher cost of capital now than what it was 24 months ago. So now you're avoiding the interest rate expense of having to use OPM, use other people's money, i.e. the bank, and you can bank on yourself. Now back to your question, Eric. So what's a return on that investment? doing the intricacies of that return on investment is beyond the scope of, I think, what you and I have the capacity to do today. I don't know that I certainly have the mental bandwidth to be able to do a total pro forma on adding another level of service, rattling that off the cuff here. But my point with that is there absolutely is a process to go through and figure out, hey, building on another lane is what, 20 grand, 30 grand, depending on how many, where you want to spend on the equipment, furnishings, fixture, FFE, furniture, fixturings, equipment. So let's just say it's 50 grand. Okay. Let's say that we need to come up with $50,000 to invest back into our business. We're banking on ourselves. We're banking on optometry. That, mind you, done correctly, is going to provide a far better return than any other advisor will talk about in their portfolio or in their brokerage account or anything like that, barring, yes, there are exceptions, but I think in a general scheme of things, we can all agree that the return on optometry is going to be much more beneficial than any other investment. That doesn't mean that we don't do those things. We diversify and we try and mitigate that risk. We reduce concentration risk. We reduce business risk. But my point with all of that is if we have a handle on our free cash flow in the practice, and we haven't redlined our lifestyle such that we need, quote unquote, need every single dollar out of the business to provide for our own personal needs, we have flexibility. And one thing that I can say with unequivocal truth is that you will make the best business decisions, or inversely, I have seen people make very bad business decisions when you are backed into a corner, right? Nobody puts baby in there, right? So, sorry, Dirty Dancing reference, or I can't believe I just did that on live, but why not, right? Let's do it. If you have that agency and flexibility, you don't have the pressure of trying to, squeeze blood out of a turnip or out of a rock, to use a biblical reference there, right?
Yeah.
You make bad decisions if you feel like you're backed into a corner. And so that's why we want to understand how much free cash flow does the practice produce, number one. Number two, what is my personal income goal that I have that the business of optometry is meant to provide for me, right? I want to run my practice intentionally, and I want to enjoy a certain amount of income on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis from my practice. And the delta between that is what we have in the business to be able to do what we want with. Maybe in some years we do actually just bring that home, but we're not necessarily up leveling our lifestyle so that we need that every single year over year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And you touch on so many key pieces. I think most notably is the fact that as a business owner, it's very easy for all of that to become commingled, right? And I mean, Adam, I know the work you all do at integrated PWM and the work that we do at Akrinos. We're connecting with a lot of these doctors at different stages of practice life cycle, and it's fascinating to see all the really neat ways that there are dollars hiding in a lot of practices, right? And maybe Adam, let's shift gears and kind of devote this closing leg of the conversation here to, as we're talking about free cash flows in the practice, let's now maybe pull out that magnifying glass and maybe share with our viewers some of the things that you all have found in your experience. Hey, this is where to look. These are some common things that we're seeing that you can take a look at your books and the decisions you're making in the practice, right? Especially when we're talking about operating expenses, right? Because I mean, there are so many, you start combing financials, like truly combing, just see where those expenses are going. And you come to realize where there may be dollars left out there. So share some of your experience here, Adam, please.
So the general, in a business or in an optometry practice, when you look at a set of financials, we can break it up basically into two different types of costs. You have your variable costs and your fixed costs. The variable costs are fairly easy to identify because those are going to be largely one, but we could kind of insert maybe two other debatable line items. So let's just say three. Generously, let's say three different items. cost of goods, which is the Captain Obvious statement, right? Those are your glasses and contacts. You need to have patience in order to sell inventory, right? So you don't incur that expense unless you have revenue. So you have a patient come in that pays you a set dollar. You have costs associated with the goods that you sold them, hence cost of goods, which shows up as a direct expense on your profit loss. So that shows up, you have gross revenue, then you have cost of goods or any other direct expenses, and then you have gross profit. Everything else below that is what we call OPEX. That's your operating expenses. Now, the other two negotiable variable expenses that I'll throw into that cost of goods would be doctor compensation if they are on a production-based salary, or that was conflicting, or production-based salary. That's if they're on a production-based pay scale or contract, right, employment agreement, and potentially your non-OD staff as well, if there's flexibility there. You'll have much more flexibility on the OD side of things and the AOD on the associate side of things than you will on your non-OD staff. Most staff don't really like the idea of being variable. They would prefer that their paychecks keep coming, and if they're paid hourly, like that there's some type of predictability there. So I would traditionally lump non-OD staff under the fixed expense side of things. Generally speaking, your direct expenses, your cost of goods, best case scenario should be in the high teens through mid 20s. If you start seeing 30% on your cost of goods, you need to have a conversation. Like, there's something missing there. There's a conversation that needs to be had with somebody. We're likely not it. We're not a buying group. We don't hold ourselves out to be that person that can help you negotiate your best buying. We are that CFO that will point you in the direction of where the landmines are, where the bodies are buried on your profit loss statement. So the other area, again, so if we have 25% on the, let's just kind of take the middle there and say your cost of goods should be 25% plus or minus, maybe, hopefully it's minus 5 to 7 percentage points. And we can say that the average, notice I didn't say best, but the average total profitability number for a practice is, let's call it 25%. That leaves 50%, 50 cents of every dollar that comes into an optometry practice falls under that fixed expense category. That falls under your operating expenses. And so now, to your point, Eric, it's a matter of going through that profit loss statement and determining where are those cents going, and is there an efficiency metric, or is there not an efficiency metric, but is there with intentionality and with focus, are there areas to improve upon that efficiency? What I have typically found is focus. I want to be careful here because I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe that's the wrong metaphor. I don't want to invoke a scarcity mindset. Sitting with your profit loss statement and trying to go through and nitpick every single expense as a way to try and save money. Like, I guess this is what I'm not saying don't do that. I'm just saying that the return on investment, figuratively speaking, that you're going to get from doing that, as opposed to seeing how you can drive more revenue while keeping costs the same, that is a much more blue ocean abundance mindset with a, arguably unlimited ceiling, right? There's only so much that you can shave off of a profit loss statement before you get down to the bone and say, I can't cut anything more. I have to have an office. I have to have this equipment. I have to have my staff. I have to have my point of sale, my mercantile exchange rate. Like, there are certain things that you're going to have in the business that eventually you get down to the point of saying, I can't really do anything more. Or if I can do anything more, are you really going to spend the hours that it's going to take to save $1,000 a year on pick a random expense? Or how about we get 2 more patients? All right, 2 more patients. Now, again, okay, in true fairness, to say, okay, I said a 25% profit margin. So if we need $1,000 of profit at 25% margin, so it's $4,000. Okay, if we have an average comp exam of, just make the math easy, we have 8 patients at $500 a comp exam. You need 8 patients to equal the net income that you saved on reducing some expense in your practice by $1,000. Are there efficiencies in your schedule, in the way that your team is confirming appointments, in the way that you're managing the schedule, in the way that you're pre-appointing? Like, are there things that you could do to find 8 patients? Mind you, this is over a year, right? Could you find 8 more patients over the course of a year to equal what you saved in my example of $1,000? So that's, and I say that because we've seen so many profit loss statements and we've gone through the financials. And yes, sometimes there are glaring, obvious areas in which we can help maybe save. The cost of goods is one certain area. I mean, if we see something over 30%, that is a do not pass go, do not collect $200 until you have a conversation to figure out at least what is causing this to happen.
Yeah.
And get clarity on that. But your rent, that's a whole nother conversation in and of itself, just because of the long-term implications of, dare I say, messing that up. Like, if you don't negotiate your rent correctly and you don't negotiate your space correctly, and you end up having, you show me a practice that has double-digit occupancy expense, and I'll show you a practice that's going to be, certainly you're taking profitability away by operating expense. I know ODs listening in California and downtown Manhattan and New York City, like, I get it. But those are also practices that are having 3 docs in a 1,500-foot space. Like, they are maximizing the footprint of literally every square foot in the space, just because occupancy rates are so high, and can very quickly eat up a decent amount of the profit loss statement relative to the availability, if you will, of that expense. Does that make sense? Sorry, I'll take a breath and a sip of coffee here, as if I need more coffee for this conversation. Right?
Well, I think the root of the matter in all of this, the root of all of this, is all about understanding the data. Yeah. I mean, it's very similar to patient care, right? And we had this conversation, and to our viewers out there that we've had the pleasure of connecting somewhere along the way. That's what it starts with, similar to patient care, and using these fascinating diagnostic tools that modern optometry now utilizes in scope of care. And similarly, utilizing these modern approaches to assessing the business. Really, really fascinating stuff here, Adam. And I think what do you say to bring it on home? You kind of share a little bit about your experience in the scope of work that you all do over at Integrated.
Well, I appreciate. I'll get to that, but I do want to circle back and just emphasize again the importance of knowing the numbers and how to best think about how to best think, like, what does that cadence of review look like, and what documents should you be looking at? So you should be looking at cash receivables weekly at the most, daily. I mean, we know ODs that will check cash receivables on a daily basis. At the end of the day, what did Jim Rome say? Cash isn't everything. Cash isn't everything, but it's right up there with oxygen. So, like, it is very, very important to your business. So you should be checking your cash receivables on a daily, no more than weekly basis. You should be running your profitability numbers on a monthly basis. So you should be pulling your profit loss statement. And we like to see, at the very minimum, you're doing a trailing 3 months up to a trailing 12 months. The reason we like that, and I learned this from Greg Crabtree, the author of Simple Numbers, Straight Talk, Big Profits, which is a great, it's a well-written book for someone that is new to business and that is learning to try and just understand some of these numbers and some of these concepts. The interview that I did with him on 2020 Money, we talked about this at length. The reason that they use trailing 3 and trailing 12 is that you're democratizing the number. Right? If we do year to date, well, year to date right now is 34 days. Year to date in the middle of March is like, there's no consistent timetable in which we're measuring the financial health. But if we're doing trailing 3 and trailing 12, especially in the trailing 12, and when Greg talked about this, it really, really made sense and resonated with me. It's like, you're getting a full year's business cycle. How many ODs that we talk with, it's like, oh, like you and I, invariably in the social circles that we run in, either 3-dimensionally or 2-dimensionally online in social media groups. What is it, in August or September? We'll see the post, "Hey, I'm really slow right now. Is anybody else really slow right now?" And people will say, "Yeah, this is a slow time." Like, we're looking for that validation that our business isn't falling off a cliff, that this is normal, and that this is just part of the ebbs and flows of the optometry cycle. And that's where having a trailing 12 always ensures that you're getting a full business cycle in with the analysis of your financials. And then you also want to be looking at that statement of cash flow, right? That statement of cash flow, the reason that I bring that back home is because over the same period, right? Trailing 3, trailing 12, the statement of cash flow, back to what I said in the very beginning, includes debt service. Because if you're just looking at how much money did my business make as net operating income, one of the biggest, not biggest, but most common questions is, hey, my profit loss said that I made this, but my bank account only says I made this. Like, well, where did it all go, right?
Yeah.
Your statement of cash flow will answer that question and show you financing activities. It'll show you how much you made in debt service payments, and it'll show you how much you as the business owner, as the practice owner, harvested out of the business to fund that lifestyle that we talked about. So that would be, again, the cadence that I don't want to overcomplicate it. If you just did those 3 things with a huge asterisk of assuming that your business books are reconciled correctly, garbage in, garbage out. So make sure that they're accurate, make sure that they're good.
Absolutely.
That'll be great. That'll give you a good insight into where your business. So I fully acknowledge that I used all my time to do it, but it's about ODs. I want to make sure that they get the next best step in all of this. They can find me on LinkedIn at integratedpwm.com. We sit in the seat of essentially being the personal and professional CFO for practice owners nationwide, boiling it down to 3 tenets, helping you proactively manage cash flow, reduce taxes, and investing prudently both in and out of your practice.
Boom. Adam Cmejla, integrated planning and wealth management. Really, really great info here, Adam. I mean, through and through. I mean, from the get-go.
Thank you.
And for those listeners, and if you're just tuning in here, definitely go back and listen to some of these things. And if you want to get deeper dive into a number of these topics, Adam referenced a few times his podcast, the 2020 Money Podcast, which is one of, I know for now, a few years running, one of the top 10 podcasts in optometry.
Yeah, coming up on 300 total episodes.
300 episodes, yeah. So absolutely, I know you take some deep dives into a few of these topics in various episodes. So for all of our viewers out there, we hope you found this valuable. As Adam Cmejla joined us, unpacking free cash flows, how you can enhance the financial health of your practice. To connect with Adam and learn more about their scope of work, head on over to integratedpwm.com, and you can find Adam on LinkedIn. And hey, if you're looking for more great practice management insights and solutions to bring your practice vision to reality, be sure you head on over to Akrinos for more great tips like this and to find the variety of the solutions that we offer. And subscribe to the Akrinos YouTube channel and follow us across the socials. Adam, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate you having me on, my friend.